Hello, everyone. All right, we are going to be reading chapter 8 on plantations and slavery. So, based on what we've learned so far, plantations, right, began in Virginia, moved on to the Carolinas, and later get established in Georgia as well. And during this time, to make those plantations profitable, the colonists turned to slavery to work the land at the level that they felt they needed their crops to be grown for profit. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And this is sometimes a little bit hard to kind of wrap our brains around because we don't have slavery anymore. We've abolished slavery in the United States. So it's important to kind of revisit this time in history, to understand what brought it here and understand the mindset behind it so that we kind of understand how we've progressed as human beings and continue to support human rights for all. All right, let's get started. Plantation workers. When Uncle Joseph first came to the colony, he brought poor people from England to do the hard work for him. He paid for their ship fare, and they worked for 5 years to pay him back. This kind of worker was called an indentured servant. While the indentured servants were serving their term, Uncle Joseph gave them food and shelter and clothing. They worked for him without pay, had to do everything he ordered, and often didn't live very well. So, back in 1619, when the first slaves were brought over, this is really what they were. They were indentured servants. And many people who wanted to come to the New World early on and didn't have money to pay for their ship's passage would enter into a contract with somebody who could pay for them. And then they would agree to work for them, basically for free, to kind of pay off the cost of the travel. An indentured servant's life was hard. There was always a danger of disease and snake bite. Working in the rice fields was especially bad. Many servants died before their 5 years were over. If they were lucky enough to survive, servants were given tools and a little money when they got their freedom. However, most former servants could not afford to buy land. They did not find the kind of life that they wanted. It's no surprise that fewer and fewer people wanted to come to America as indentured servants, right? The word gets out as to how successful or unsuccessful people are. And so as they wrote home to families and communicated what life was like, people were kind of like, yeah, I'm not so sure that's what I want to sign up for. More workers needed. Uncle Joseph wanted to grow and sell more rice. To do this, he decided to use slaves from Africa instead of indentured servants. He liked the idea for several reasons, and this is one of your questions to kind of key into. First, he would own slaves for as long as they lived. The slaves would never be free. He would never have to pay them. All he had to give them was enough food, clothing, and shelter to keep them alive and working. Second, when the slave women had babies, right, because they established their own culture, traditions, way of life, and relationships with one another, those children were also his slaves. When they grew old enough to start working, he could keep them or sell them to some other owners. In this way, his plantation would continue to have a steady supply of workers. So I want you to kind of pause for a moment and kind of think about what we're really talking about here, right? We're talking about people that are being sold as property, that are working for no pay and literally have no rights. We're talking about slaves who build relationships and connections with one another and even have families. And thinking about taking those children from those families and selling them as property to another owner. And it is really disturbing to think about that. We don't sell people anymore, right? That is not part of our history right now. This is something that has happened long ago. So it's, you know, it is really hard to imagine the strength that these people had to have to survive during this time and to find enough happiness to have relationships with one another and build families. Their perseverance and determination to live is really amazing and something that I think is important to remember even in our process of learning how troubling this time was. Some of the slaves working for Uncle Joseph had been rice farmers in Africa, and they knew how to grow rice, which no English indentured servants knew how to do. With slaves who knew rice farming, Uncle Joseph could have more rice plantations. They also came with a unique skill set. When Eliza comes to stay with his family, Uncle Joseph is already making plans to buy more land and more slaves. He decides that when his brother, Captain Edward, returns with his cargo of slaves from Africa, he will buy as many slaves as he can afford. Uncle Joseph loves his family and wants them to live well, but he does not really care how his slaves live. He just wants them to stay alive, obey his commands, work hard, and tend his rice fields. Like most English people of the time, he is sure that Black people are not as good as whites and that there is nothing wrong with owning Black slaves. So, this was also a mindset that these Africans that were being brought over were less than people. And it is, I think, easier for a person to accept their behavior when they view what they're doing as reasonable, right? Well, these people aren't even the same as us. Well, they are, but telling yourself that they're not kind of somehow, I think, gave people a reason to think it was okay. Uncle Joseph sits in his plantation office for a long time. He is thinking about the slaves he will buy from Captain Edward. Even as he is thinking about them, slaves in Africa are beginning their journey to California. They have been kidnapped by slave traders and to Carolina and chained together around the neck and legs. They are forced to march the west coast of Africa. So they're captured in Africa, forced to walk to the coast. The slaves have to walk fast for a great distance. If they don't walk fast enough, the slave traders beat them. When the slaves get to the end of their long march, the coast, the slave traders lock them up. They have to wait until someone comes to buy them. The slaves are hungry and tired from walking so far. Many are sick, and all are afraid. Captain Edward Jones leaves Charleston the next morning as soon as the rice and tobacco are loaded on the Raven. His voyage to England goes very well. He delivers his cargo from Carolina. He stays in England long enough to buy some pretty things for Eliza and Nell. He also buys lots of guns and cloth. Then, loaded with his cargo, the Raven sets sail for the west coast of Africa. There, he can trade for slaves. So he takes his goods from Carolina, goes to England, sells them or trades them, loads up with goods that he knows he can trade for slaves, and is now going to the west coast of Africa to make that trade. Early one morning, the Raven sails up to the African slave traders' dock. The slaves on the shore have never seen such a large ship. The sailors begin unloading the guns and cloth that the ship has carried from England. Later that day, the slaves are brought out, and Captain Edward chooses about 200 of them. Those slaves are taken to the hold of the Raven, which is the big belly of the ship. The slaves are packed together so that they cannot move around. It is dark and hot, and many of the slaves cry because they are so afraid of what will happen to them. Many have never seen white men before. None has ever seen a ship as large as the one before them or sailed on the ocean. The slaves lie chained in the dark hold for a very long time, and then they hear the sailors shouting, and the Raven moves away from the dock and out to sea. Captain Edward Jones watches from the deck as the Raven sails away from the African coast. He's very pleased with his slave cargo. He feels sure that he will make a lot of money when he sells them. He does not care that they are afraid and terribly uncomfortable stuffed together in that dark, smelly hold under the deck. He gives them only enough food and water to keep them alive because he wants to sell them in Charleston. The ship takes the slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. The voyage from Africa to America is called the Middle Passage. It takes from 4 to 6 weeks if the winds are blowing the right way. If not, the voyage could take months and most of the slaves will die. So remember, you know, these people are packed together, like length, like not quite shoulder to shoulder, but very close. There are no bathrooms. They're fed just barely enough and given enough water to survive. So if on this journey the winds are not in their favor and it takes longer than it should, more and more of them cannot survive. Many of the slaves get sick because the hold is so crowded and dirty, right? You have people living there together in such close proximity, and there's no bathrooms, there's no sanitate, nothing to clean. Germs and bacteria, things breed, and you can get really, really sick. They can't even get up to go to the bathroom. Sick slaves start to die, and their bodies are tossed overboard. During the last part of the voyage to Charleston, Captain Edward has the sailors bring the slaves up on deck a few at a time. He orders them to clean the slaves and to let them breathe some fresh air. When the Raven docks in Charleston, Captain Edward sells many of the slaves to his brother Joseph. They will work on Uncle Joseph's rice plantation for the rest of their lives. In 1710, when Uncle Joseph was building up his plantations and Captain Edward was bringing slaves to Charleston, the whole colony was called Carolina. But 10 years later, in 1720, the colonists living around Charleston asked to be made into a separate colony. It was called South Carolina. In 1729, the rest of the colony became North Carolina. The two Carolinas were both slave colonies, but in many other ways, the two colonies were different. Planters in South Carolina grew rice, and they brought in so many slaves that more than half of the population was African. In 1739, many of the slaves rebelled, but the revolt was cruelly put down, which means that even though they tried to fight back, they were overpowered by the plantation owners and the people in power. And when they say the revolt was cruelly put down, that means that there was a lot of violence and cruelty to put an end to that revolt. Then more slaves than ever were brought in. So once they kind of squashed that rebellion, it kind of just ensured the floodgates for more to come in. North Carolina produced mostly tobacco and not much rice. Unlike South Carolina, North Carolina didn't have any large towns or good ports. Most of its white people lived on scattered farms and owned only a few slaves. So North Carolina looked a little different than the South. They didn't have the huge plantations. North and South Carolina, like the rest of the colonies, were places where settlers from Europe could make new homes and better lives for themselves. Sadly, this often meant that Native Americans were driven off the land and that Africans were brought in chains to be slaves. So, where this point in history, learning about the first colonies that were established in the New World is exciting and adventurous and has all of these pieces of promise and future, you know, I don't know, exciting directions to go. It really was devastating for Native Americans because they were pushed off their land and many were killed in battle or by disease. And then you have this bringing over of these Africans who had been captured and sold and then brought to a land where they don't speak the language, they don't know the land, they don't know the culture, and they're separated from pretty much everybody they know. So, and then there's the hard labor and the mistreatment and the cruelty that goes along with it. So it's this part of history is definitely a mixed bag and an important one to remember that um, it is the foundation of our country, which is wonderful because here we are now and we are great at learning from our mistakes and improving ourselves as people. But it's important to revisit that that process was there and those things were in place, and that it's important to remember them and learn from them. All right, next time. See ya.